Nicocli is a small town on Colombia's Caribbean coast, known mostly for, as one travel headline put it, crabs, coconuts, and volcano swimming. When Tom Hayden wrote that column in 2011, he could focus on how, quote, the town's charm relies on its surrounding natural beauty, which provides visitors with the opportunity to relax and soak up the sun. His descriptions include gorging yourself on sweet, juicy mangoes, going crabbing, and walking to the local volcano where you can jump straight into, he wrote, the murky, muddy crater of the volcano. The feeling is truly bizarre as you half float and half sink in the midst of this active volcano, toying with the squelchy, infirm floor beneath you. It sounds idyllic and delightful, and I have to admit, I found myself peeking around Airbnb after reading the travel article. I very much wish that this was all we had to say about the lovely town of Nicocli. But I would guess that if you've heard of this idyllic town at all, it's not because of the juicy mangoes or volcano swimming. Beyond the sunny beaches, perfect for napping in a hammock, the roads that take you there also take you as close as you can get to Panama, where refugees seeking asylum in the USA must cross a dangerous stretch of jungle known as the Darien Gap. But that is a risk that has been increasingly worth taking for thousands of Haitians after waves of tragedies in their nation. Centuries of economic and social injustice compounded with natural disasters, the pandemic, and political violence and unrest. As a result, more than 70,000 people this year alone have decided that crossing the Darien Gap is the best option they have. Last September, Nicocli's mayor, Jorge Duban, reported that between 1,000 and 1,500 migrants were arriving every single day, while only 500 were allowed to leave across the Gulf and migrate to Panama due to the arrangements between those two nations. As the backlog grew, more than 14,000 migrants were stuck in Nicocli. Once you could leave, the challenges awaiting in the jungle ranged from steep terrain to dangerous animals. Astrid Suarez, reporting for the Associated Press, described one group's experience. She wrote, "They descended a steep hill and waded across a river where the water reached waist level. The current was strong and the sound of the water drowned out the voices of migrants and guides. As they headed into the rainforest, many of the migrants became exhausted and started leaving some of their belongings behind to carry less weight. Wedding portraits, jackets, and jeans were strewn along the trail." Diseases also abound, especially foot funguses, gastrointestinal problems, and respiratory infections. As Suarez reported, children have reportedly died in the jungle, and some pregnant women have given birth there. Migrants say they've seen skulls and cadavers along the routes that cross the Darien. Despite all of this, the greatest dangers come from other humans, often in the form of trafficking, banditry, and sexual assault. As a refugee named Lafleur put it, fear is always with us, but we have no choice but to keep on going. Of course, and unfortunately, if you do successfully reach the U.S. border by whatever route, your troubles are not over. Last month, shocking evidence of the mistreatment of Haitian refugees by the U.S. Border Patrol at the International Bridge in Del Rio was in the news. Officers on horseback chased down and lassoed refugees, screamed obscenities at them, and otherwise abused these asylum seekers in ways that evoke the United States' ongoing and terrifying history of anti-Black violence. The cruelty was so blatant that human rights experts with the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner rather quickly condemned the United States of America's, in their statement, recent and ongoing systematic mass deportation of Haitian migrants and refugees, and cautioned that such collective expulsions violate international law. In response, the Department of Homeland Security temporarily suspended the Horse Patrol and promised to, quote, investigate the incidents and take disciplinary actions if warranted. I don't know how anyone watching those videos could have thought they aren't warranted. Nevertheless, deportations continue at an increased rate using Title 42, which is a Trump-era, COVID-era excuse to use public health as an excuse to remove migrants and deny them a chance to seek asylum. In one interview with NPR, Gibbons Revolu, one of the refugees who was deported to Haiti, spoke up in October about the harrowing experiences his family suffered, compounded with the shock of being refused to even ask for asylum. He said, "After all the decades of U.S. meddling in Haiti's affairs, I truly believed I'd be allowed to apply for asylum at the border. We never thought we'd end up back in Haiti. Haiti is like a war zone right now. Shootings are rampant. People are being killed for small things. It's not a livable country. It's very dangerous." The New York Times painted a similar picture. Quote, "After years enduring hunger, poverty, and daily power cuts, Haitians say their country, the poorest in the Western Hemisphere, is in the worst state they have seen, with the government unable to provide the most basic services." And if you've kept up with that news, you know that kidnapping became so common this year that schools started shutting down and students started organizing fundraisers to ransom their schoolmates. Controversies over the president's 5-year term, when it would end, combined with efforts to change the nation's constitution in order to expand presidential powers, left Haiti, in the words of a statement from Catholic bishops, on the verge of explosion. And it exploded. In July, President Jovenel Moïse was assassinated. In August, Haiti suffered a devastating earthquake that left over 2,200 people dead, 12,200 injured, and at least 650,000, hundreds of thousands of them children, in need of assistance of some kind. And even as COVID risks increased in the wake of that tragedy, Haiti also had to deal with the damage or destruction of 66 health facilities in the quake. I still believe in the basic capacity of human goodness. So witnessing cruel treatment of people, the people who just had gone through all those things I listed, witnessing that cruel treatment of people asking for help forces me to ask, how could anyone respond to that kind of suffering with anything but compassion? What makes it possible to respond to people seeking safety and a better life with lassos, obscenities, harsh treatment, and deportation? As Revolu knew, the United States has a long history of imposing its political and economic will on Haiti, robbing that nation of self-determination and social stability, and helping create the conditions that plague Haiti today. Moreover, U.S. policies on Haiti have normalized mistreatment of Haitian refugees while setting the precedent for expanded immigrant detention. Professor Carl Linskog, author of Detain and Punish, has shown that in one interview, as he said, policies were specifically designed to deter Haitians from coming in. These policies became the prototype of what became a global system of migrant incarceration. We can go back just a few decades to get a fuller picture. In the 1970s, working-class Haitians began coming by boat to the United States to make asylum claims. The United States was already in the midst of a racist backlash to the civil rights movement, and Black Haitian migrants stepped into that context and received similar mistreatment. Linskog explained that the Carter administration introduced something called the Haitian Program, a punishing set of policies designed to deter Haitians from coming in. And if they were already here, it tried to keep them out of the mainstream population. That meant putting them in detention facilities and local jails, basically denying them carte blanche their asylum claims and just sending them back. Sound familiar? Legal challenges would overturn the Haitian program, but the Carter administration circumvented that judgment, and then the Reagan administration went further, introducing, in Linskog's words, a new Haitian detention program and the policy of interdiction, in which Coast Guard cutters would intercept boats of Haitian asylum seekers before they could even reach land and send them back, often to violence and death in Haiti. And that went on for decades. And its legacy goes on even today in the recent stories in our headlines and in the statistics that have documented continued anti-Haitian and anti-Black violence against immigrants. For example, the Refugee and Immigration Center for Education and Legal Services documented that during 2020, the share of Haitian families in detention increased to an alarming 44% of the total of all families. In fact, the United States has consistently detained more Haitian families in 2020 than any other nationality. And again, that anti-Haitian detention helped set the precedent for mass incarceration of hundreds of thousands of immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. According to the Global Detention Project, the U.S. has the world's largest immigration detention system. On any given day, there are more than 50,000 non-citizens in detention, spread over 200 facilities that dot the map of the United States. Most people I speak with about border issues are not aware of that, and also not aware of how extensive and expansive border patrols are in the United States, including warrantless searches within, as the government describes them, a reasonable distance from any external boundary of the United States. As the ACLU explains, the federal government defines that reasonable distance as 100 air miles. Combined with other federal regulations and laws, the result is that about 2/3 of the U.S. population, or about 200 million people, reside within that reasonable distance, and they're subject to all the things that go with that. Most of the 10 largest cities in the United States, the ACLU goes on to say, such as New York City, LA, and Chicago, fall into the region. Some states like Florida lie entirely within the border, so their entire populations are impacted. Officers create immigration checkpoints, board buses and trains to demand documents, and pull over motorists. With such a large area to patrol, the Customs and Border Protection Agency has become the largest law enforcement agency in the United States, with nearly 20,000 agents. It is also, as Andrea Flores and Shaw Drake documented for the ACLU, the largest law enforcement air force in the world, roughly equivalent to the size of Brazil's combat air force, with fleets of planes, helicopters, and Predator drones. Its rapid growth over the last 20 years has been matched with growing violence. Again, with Flores and Drake, they wrote, at least 102 people have died as a result of encounters with Border Patrol in the last decade. 6 of these deaths were caused by Border Patrol agents shooting across the border into Mexico. Murders met with complete impunity. The agency also lacks basic accountability practices. No agent, they wrote, has ever been convicted of criminal wrongdoing while on duty, despite deaths in custody and uses of excessive deadly force. Border Patrol agents engage in criminal activities outside their official duties at 5 times the rate of other law enforcement agencies' officials. The agency's discipline system is broken, and agency leadership has not weeded out corrupt agents. As James Tomczyk, CBP's former Internal Affairs Chief, described the agency's culture, it goes out of its way to evade legal restraints and is clearly engineered to interfere with oversight efforts to hold the Border Patrol accountable. If we put the history of the Border Patrol in context, I think we can understand a little bit better of where this lack of accountability comes from, because the Border Patrol has deeply xenophobic and racist roots. In a special report by the American Immigration Council, Katie Mirza and Walter Ewing wrote that the racial animus of U.S. immigration policy in the late 19th and early 20th century formed the foundation of the agency. Federal laws banning Asian immigration were followed by the national origins quota system, which prioritized Northern and Western Europeans, you can read that as white, over the rest of the world. While not included in the original quotas, Mexicans who previously could travel freely across the U.S.-Mexico border began to experience increasing restrictions in the 1920s. Congress created the Border Patrol in 1924 to patrol the northern and southern borders between the ports of entry. Many officers came from organizations with a history of racial violence and brutality, including the Ku Klux Klan and the Texas Rangers, carrying over the culture of a racist brotherhood into the new agency. These connections keep resurfacing in reports of racial slurs, sexual comments, and other offensive language by Border Patrolmen. Lawsuits have shown that the Border Patrol uses racial profiling and has maintained connections with white supremacist movements and the paramilitary SWAT-style Border Patrol Tactical Unit, which has, incidentally, also been used to crack down on protests of police brutality against black people. Like other law enforcement agencies, the Border Patrol has been increasingly militarized since the 1980s. Then, in 1994, one of the most significant landmarks or milestones in the way the United States deals with borders, we began a program, the government did, a program of what's called prevention through deterrence, which, simply put, aims to make it so dangerous to try to enter the United States that nobody will want to do it. After the 9/11 attacks, the Border Patrol was made part of the Department of Homeland Security, which expanded the agency and further accelerated its militarization. The end result has been the creation of an agency that perpetuates, in the report's words, violence in the form of killing, sexual assault, excessive force, and verbal degradation, all with impunity. Despite these problems, the Border Patrol has lowered hiring standards to pursue rapid staff expansion. The Border Patrol often perpetuates violence through less direct means, including medical abuse and neglect, inhumane custody conditions, and family separation. And that, the Border Patrol I've just described, is the very agency we saw on horseback chasing down asylum seekers from Haiti. My best understanding of our collective cruelty is that the inevitability of borders and with them the inevitability of border violence has become so normalized that we just accept it without question. We're trained to believe that violent borders are the price of domestic and economic security. So collectively, we turn the other way when people are mistreated at our borders. And we avoid learning both the reasons people take these risks to cross a border or the possibilities of living in some other way. It's easier to look away from or to dehumanize the millions of people who suffer. Rhys Jones in Violent Borders, Refugees and the Right to Move demonstrated that borders help establish a legal means for controlling resources and excluding others from these spaces, with the result that almost all of the land in the world is claimed in this way today. It's tempting to believe that these borders, or at least these kinds of borders, have existed forever. But the reality is that the system we take for granted today is relatively recent. Jones pointed out that, quote, even the oldest political borders are only a few hundred years old, and most are only a few decades old. They are not the result of a transparent sorting of historical peoples into their own territories. Instead, borders are an efficient system for maintaining political control of an area through agreements and documents that are backed up with the threat of violence. They change the relationship, and this is a really key point, they change the relationship between people and the environment by redefining land and oceans as closed areas of ownership that could be exploited for economic gain, not common spaces to be shared and conserved. So the borders are real and have real impacts, but they're not objective or neutral. Their history, along with their psychosocial meanings, reflect, among other things, the injustice of colonial violence. This context helps us understand conditions that must be addressed if we want to live in healthy, safe, sustainable, and regenerative communities. We can help do this work, beginning with becoming increasingly aware of this violent history and how it has become embedded in our nation's policies, institutions, and practices. Mirza and Ewing concluded that, quote, revamping the agency, the Border Patrol, will involve fundamentally reshaping how Border Patrol agents view themselves in relation to the different communities and groups of people they encounter along the border. And that applies to all of us, especially all of us who are white. But better understanding helps us notice the social norms that fuel this injustice. We can think deeply about and act courageously in favor of honoring our shared humanity and our relationship with the earth. We can help move the broader culture toward transforming our society, how our society thinks about and experiences relationships across differences. As John Washington wrote, what we ultimately fear, what we ultimately hate, is so often an outward manifestation of our own action or inaction. Waiting for the government to offer to share its roof or to implement any positive change will be waiting too long. Meanwhile, we should open our churches, temples, mosques, schools, and homes. We should build communities that are willing and able to receive those in need, not merely incarcerate or expel them. What Washington's talking about will look different. It will look particular to the place where each of us live, but it's something we can do, and it's something that must be done. The world overflows with possibilities for happiness, those juicy mangoes on a Nakokli beach. And there's enough happiness for all of us if we are willing. If we are willing, we can face our fears. We can dismantle injustice and make a place where everyone can be safe and joyfully at home. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.